Hey, Tiffany, this is Keith. Hey, sometimes it's just easier to talk about an issue rather than write it down, because it would probably take me a while to write all this down. So I wanted to get back to you. I did see your question, and I appreciate your question. I understand the difficulty of it. I'm sure that a lot of people have struggled with that, including myself. And so I believe that your question is, why does God judge us for what seems to be inevitable? And so I think your concern is sinning, right? We know that all of us eventually will sin. All of us. The Bible is clear in that, right? We are all sinners. Romans 3 makes that very clear. There are none righteous, no, not one. So if all of us sin, then why, if it seems inevitable, then why would God judge us for something that seems that we can't avoid? So I wanted to talk about two kinds of judgment. There's a temporal judgment. Certainly when we sin, we have to deal with the consequences of that sin. And that's more of a temporal thing, right? And so whether we sin against, our friends and family and people, there's a consequence with that. Or perhaps if we sin against the Lord, there is a shame to deal with. Adam and Eve in the garden, the moment they sinned, who ran? They ran from God. God actually pursues them in the garden. So God comes after them in a relationship. But nonetheless, we're talking about two kinds of judgment. And I think there's the temporal judgment that happens immediately when we sin. But I think you're talking about the eternal judgment, right? So do we go to heaven or hell, right? And so two kinds of judgment, one temporal, one eternal. I think there's another thing we should talk about, and that's righteousness. The Bible also speaks about two kinds of righteousness. In Romans chapter 3, forget that. There's two kinds of righteousness. There's a righteousness by works, and there's a righteousness by faith. The righteousness by works, we know, Romans 3, none are righteous, no, not one. No one can earn righteousness through their own works. But there's that other kind of righteousness, the righteousness that is by faith. That kind of righteousness says that I am going to quit placing trust in myself to try to earn salvation, and I am instead going to trust in the one who is salvation. And I believe the enemy, and even in a lot of religious circles, they are so focused on righteousness by works, so focused on sin. And so I believe it's easy for us to get this mindset that the reason why I would be eternally judged is because I'm a sinner, right? But that's not what we see, right? We see the story of the wedding feast in Matthew, right? Where God sends the invitation out to all of the good and the bad alike, right? Sinners, righteousness by works, and righteousness by faith. The message goes out to all, right? But the only condition is that you be found in the garment. And the garment is this picture of righteousness by faith, right? The minute we accept the Lord, we receive upon us his righteousness. And God no longer looks upon us as a sinner, but he sees Christ in his righteousness. And so the world wants us to continue to look back at our sin problem, right? But we know that the minute we place our trust in the Lord, that the veil has been torn, right? We are no longer living in the old covenant. We are now in the new covenant, right? We know where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And so I think to answer your question, perhaps the world wants us to get focused on our temporal judgment, on our sin, but that's not at all what the Lord judges us for. In the end, eternally, we will be judged as to whether or not we accept him or whether we reject him, right? And so all those who have put on his righteousness, right, who are believing by faith, have accepted him, right? And all those who have rejected him, even though both categories are sinners, all those who have rejected him, he allows them to go their own way. How unrighteous would it be for a loving God to force someone who doesn't want to be in his presence, someone who has rejected him? How unrighteous would it be for him to force that person upon him and in heaven when they don't want to be there? So I think it's a matter of perspective, right? I hope that helps. To summarize it, we don't have to fear the judgment of God based on a sin here and there. What we have to fear is a judgment from God where we have rejected him, because that's an eternal judgment. I hope that helps. See ya.